She was 54, abandoned at the altar, humiliated in front of an entire town. But what happened next, no one saw coming. A stranger stepped forward not to rescue her, but to honor her. What started with heartbreak became the most unexpected love story ever whispered through the valleys of Jackson Hole. This isn't just about romance, it's about reclaiming dignity, rewriting fate, and proving you're never too old to begin again. Stay with us, this ending will leave you breathless. The train pulled into Jackson Hole with a sound that felt more like a warning than a welcome. Steam hissed from the iron beast, and in its echoing release came silence, a heavy kind that settled deep into Grace McAllister's bones. She stepped down from the final carriage with a single suitcase in one hand, a tin of cinnamon cookies in the other, and no one waiting for her. She was 47 years old and alone, not the kind of alone that comes from being forgotten at a party or overlooked in a crowd. The kind of alone that builds itself into your skin, that lives in your bones like a second skeleton. The kind that echoes louder when you try to deny it. That day, as the snow whispered around her boots and the sky sat low and heavy with the weight of winter, Grace was not running toward something. She was walking away from what had finally broken her. 3 weeks earlier, she'd stood in her sister's empty apartment in Chicago, clearing out the final drawer of the life they had once shared. Her sister, the last of her family, had died quietly, leaving behind fading photographs, half-written letters, and a woman who now had no reason to stay. Grace had been a nurse, a good one, but cutbacks had turned that chapter into memory too. It was as if the world had begun erasing her before she had a chance to finish writing herself. Then came the ad. A friend clipped it from a Wyoming newspaper and mailed it with a note that said, "Only, maybe this is something." A widower named Walter Camden was looking for companionship. Not romance, not passion, he'd specified, just shared work, shared values, maybe a peaceful life in the quiet cold of the West. She read it 3 times before daring to answer. The letters that followed were brief but kind. He wrote of a simple life, a house with creaking steps, a porch that overlooked frozen pastures, and an old dog who still chased shadows. Grace replied with honesty. She told him she didn't expect much, that she knew how to work hard, bake bread from scratch, and keep secrets she didn't want to tell. He never said he loved her, but he said he was ready for something steady. At 47, she thought maybe that was what she needed most. So she packed 1 suitcase, 1 good coat, 1 green dress with a hem she'd repaired herself, and a tin of cinnamon cookies because in one letter Walter had mentioned liking cinnamon. It had been a long time since anyone's preferences had mattered to her. She baked them slowly, whispering a hope into each one. The journey west felt like peeling back layers of a life that had once been vibrant. Each hour of train travel took her further from the city that no longer held her story. She didn't sleep much, but she dreamed in fragments, porch swings, quiet dinners, hands touching out of habit instead of heat. Things she'd once laughed at now seemed like salvation. And then the train stopped. Jackson Hole was beautiful in the kind of way that made you feel small. The mountains rose like sleeping giants, snow draped across their shoulders, while cabins lined the main street like stitched buttons on a winter coat. It was a place where the past and future could coexist without noise. Grace stepped onto the platform and scanned the crowd. There were mothers pulling children in sleds, a man delivering parcels, and shopkeepers exchanging pleasantries. But no Walter, no dog, no outstretched hand waiting to take her suitcase. She waited 15 minutes before accepting what her gut already knew. No one was coming. She walked toward town with her suitcase dragging slightly behind her, the tin tucked firmly under her arm like it still had a purpose. At the edge of the main road stood a boarding house with a shingle that read Heart Spring Inn. A woman in her 60s opened the door, her apron dusted with flour. Room she asked without preamble. Yes, Grace replied. Just a few nights. The room upstairs was small, warm, and smelled like lavender and old pages. Grace unpacked, slowly placing the cookies by the window and unfolding her dress across the bed. On the desk sat the last letter Walter had written her. Meet me at St. Andrew's Church on the 19th. Wear your best. Everything's arranged. That was tomorrow. So she waited. The next morning, she walked the town. No one said much. A few nodded. Some stared longer than they should have. She could feel the questions behind their eyes. Is that the woman? The one from Chicago? Still hoping she didn't answer them aloud, but every step she took was its own reply. That night she laid her green dress out again. She brushed her hair with care, braided it simply down her back, and whispered something into the silence. Not a prayer, not quite, but close enough. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone the world had tried to forget, but who had not forgotten herself. She fastened each button slowly, because sometimes dignity doesn't arrive with applause or flowers. Sometimes it walks in quietly carrying cookies, wearing a hand-mended dress, and daring to believe it still belongs. Grace didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew she would show up, because even when the world stopped waiting for her, she had learned the power of waiting for herself. And that kind of hope, that's the kind that changes everything. It was the kind of morning that carried both promise and warning, the kind of day when the air itself felt like it was holding its breath. Grace McAllister rose before the sun touched the peaks, her hand steady as she lit the small oil lamp beside her bed. The green dress waited quietly, folded and ready just as it had been the night before. She had pressed it until her arms ached. It wasn't vanity, it was ritual, a declaration. Today, she would be seen. The streets of Jackson Hole were hushed, the kind of hush that made every footstep sound louder than it should. The snow under her boots crunched like a whispered warning. St. Andrew's Church stood at the far end of Main Street, modest, and whitewashed its steeple, slicing the pale morning sky. Grace's breath came out in small puffs. As she climbed the stone steps, the tin of cookies balanced in one gloved hand. She paused at the doors, took a breath so deep it rattled her ribs and pushed them open. Inside, the church was mostly empty. A few townspeople sat scattered in the pews. Faces she had passed on the street now turned toward her, with expressions that ranged from polite curiosity to barely disguised pity. She offered no smiles. She simply walked forward, slow and deliberate every step in answer to every whisper she'd overheard all week. But there was no Walter, no man in a suit waiting by the altar, no dog curled by the pews, no bouquet, no music. Instead, a boy no older than 10 approached her, his hands shaking slightly as he held out a folded piece of paper. Grace took it without a word. Her fingers hesitated only for a second before opening the note. Grace, I'm sorry. I can't do this. I've thought it over, and I don't believe this arrangement is right. I wish you the best. Walter. The words blurred not from tears but from the cold clarity of humiliation. The silence in the church changed then. It thickened, became something that wrapped around her shoulders like a weight. She could hear the breath of every person in the room feel their eyes like needles along the seams of her dress. She had imagined many things, nerves, delays, even a postponement. But never this. Grace didn't cry. She didn't faint or flee. Instead, she looked up, folded the letter carefully as if it were any other piece of correspondence, and tucked it into her coat. Then she turned and faced them. My name, she said. Voice even is Grace McAllister. I came here by train with one suitcase and a tin of cookies. I came because someone asked me to. Someone who promised something ordinary, not love, not magic, just a shared roof and a kind word now and then. The church remained still. I was not promised a wedding. I was promised respect. And though it appears that promise has been broken, I have not. She walked down the center aisle, her head high. Each step echoed like punctuation. She reached the bottom stair, turned once more. For anyone here wondering what disappointment looks like when it comes dressed in dignity, this is it. Not because I was rejected, but because I chose to show up anyway. A ripple moved through the room. Some dropped their gaze. Others looked stunned. And just as she placed her foot on the final step, a voice rose from the back. "Then, let me stand with you." The words cut through the silence like sunlight through storm clouds. Grace turned slowly. A man stepped forward. Broad-shouldered, rugged, a little older than middle age. His boots were dusted with snow, his coat frayed at the collar. But his eyes held no pity, only certainty. "My name's Caleb Rowe," he said. "I saw how you stood just now. That's more strength than I've seen in a long time. If a woman can walk through a storm like that and still hold her ground well, I'd like to know her." Gasps fluttered through the crowd. Walter, who had slipped in unnoticed near the side, paled. But Caleb didn't glance his way. His gaze never left Grace. She blinked. Once. Twice. Her fingers gripped the tin tighter. Why, she asked barely above a whisper. "Because someone like you shouldn't have to walk back out those doors feeling smaller than when she came in. Because I believe some stories deserve a new chapter, and maybe you're mine." She stood still for a long moment. In that space-time seemed to stop. Her life, once reduced to empty rooms and folded linens, suddenly felt full of questions she wanted to answer. Not for him, for herself. Grace looked around the church. She saw every face, the shameful glances, the curious ones, the mouths slightly open as if holding their breath. And she thought, maybe this isn't the end. Maybe this is where it begins. And then, with more grace than her name had ever required of her, she nodded. To him, to herself, to the life that might still be waiting. As they walked out together side by side, the tin of cookies now held between them, the townsfolk parted. Not out of shock, not out of scandal, but because when a woman rises from public rejection and chooses herself anyway, she doesn't just change her story, she changes the town's. And maybe she changes what it means to be chosen at all. The snow continued to fall, but softer now. The wind had quieted. Outside, the street was still. Grace and Caleb walked slowly, not speaking, as though afraid any sound might break the strange and fragile magic that had just been born. When they reached the edge of town, Caleb stopped. "You don't have to say anything," he said gently. I couldn't let you leave thinking no one saw what you did in there." Grace looked up at him. "And what did I do?" "You reminded us," he said, "that sometimes strength doesn't roar. Sometimes it walks down the center aisle of a church and refuses to be ashamed." She looked away, her eyes stinging for the first time that day. But they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of release. She had come for one man's promise and found her own voice instead. As they turned toward the open road, Grace let out a long breath she didn't know she'd been holding. The kind of breath that comes when a door long closed finally creaks open. And somewhere beneath the snow and silence, a new story had already begun. Grace McAllister never imagined the next chapter of her life would begin in silence. Not the kind of silence that came from awkwardness or distance, but something gentler, more honest. It was the silence of two people building trust one moment at a time, without needing to fill the space with noise. That was the first thing she noticed about life with Caleb Rowe. They rode out of Jackson Hole in his weathered wagon, bundled against the cold, saying little. The town disappeared behind them, swallowed by trees and snow. Before her stretched a vast, unfamiliar land, quiet, formidable, and breathtakingly still. She had known cities all her life. She had known noise schedules, rooms filled with other people's pain. But now, as they traveled through Grand Teton Valley, she was introduced to something new, the quiet language of the earth. The ranch was modest, nestled against a ridge where the wind whispered through pine trees. 2 barns, 1 stable, a chicken coop half covered in snow, and a farmhouse with a wide porch and smoke curling from its chimney. It didn't look like much, but to Grace it felt like possibility. Caleb helped her down from the wagon, taking her suitcase in silence. Inside, the house smelled of pine and bread. The floors creaked. The windows fogged over from the heat of the fire. Her room was simple: a wooden bed, a dresser, a quilt sewn with stars. "This is yours," Caleb said softly. "We can take things slow, no rush, just start where we are." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to her in years. In the days that followed, they found a rhythm. Caleb rose early to tend the animals. Grace followed soon after, sweeping, organizing, cooking, folding laundry, with a deliberate grace born of years spent taking care of others. She patched torn shirts. She stacked books on the windowsill. She made soup the way her mother once had, adding rosemary from a tiny bundle she'd brought from Chicago. They shared meals by the fire. Some nights they talked about small things like weather and fences. Other nights they sat in silence, listening to the pop of wood in the stove. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was patient, familiar. There was comfort in simply being seen. One afternoon, Caleb returned from town with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. He handed it to her without ceremony. Inside was a journal, its leather cover smooth and untouched. "Figured you might want to write," he said. "Saw it at the general store." Grace turned it over in her hands. It had been years since she'd written anything personal. Most of her life had been filled with lists, schedules, prescriptions. But this was a space for her voice. Her story. She began writing each morning after breakfast. At first, only a few lines, then full pages. About the land. About the quiet. About Caleb's kindness. About how strange it felt to feel needed again. Not as a nurse, not as a sister, but simply as a woman. She also began teaching again. A neighbor's child was struggling with reading, and the mother asked Grace for help. 1 student became 3. Soon, every Tuesday and Thursday, her front room filled with small boots and eager eyes. Caleb built a bench for the porch so parents could wait. The town, once skeptical, began to shift. They stopped calling her the woman from Chicago and started calling her Miss Grace. They brought eggs pie seeds. They smiled when they passed her on the road. One morning, Grace stood at the edge of the pasture, watching a calf wobble behind its mother. Caleb joined her, leaning on the fence. "You're different here," he said quietly. She smiled. "Maybe I'm finally allowed to be." He nodded. "You bring a kind of peace, the kind that stays." She didn't reply, but her heart did. It beat slow and steady, as if recognizing the truth of his words. Spring came early that year. The snow melted into thirsty soil, and Grace found herself drawn to the garden. Caleb turned the soil while she planted rows of beans, potatoes, carrots. One day, he returned with a basket of seeds and new gloves. "Thought you might like your own tools," he said. It wasn't flowers or poetry, it was better. It was thoughtfulness. It was presence. Their days unfolded with simple grace. He whistled while he worked. She hummed while she cooked. He carved spoons from scrap wood. She sewed new curtains. They weren't lovers, not yet, but there was something deepening a current between them that didn't need to rush. One night, after supper, Caleb brought out an old photo. It was of a woman with kind eyes. My mother, he said, she married late. Folks thought it was foolish. But she raised 3 boys and loved my father till the day he died. Grace traced the edge of the picture. You looked at me like you saw her, she whispered. I did, he said. And something else. Dignity. The kind that doesn't ask permission. Grace went to bed that night holding the journal against her chest. It had been a long time since she'd felt like the heroine of her own story. For too long she'd been the caregiver, the observer, the one who folded towels while others danced. But here in the hush of the valley, in the warmth of a man who didn't flinch from silence, she began to believe in something again. Not rescue, not romance, but recognition. And in the soil, they turned the silences they shared, something beautiful had begun to grow. Not quickly, but surely. And perhaps just in time. The storm didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly, the way all real trouble does, soft flakes at first, then wind like a roar from beneath the earth. The sun had shone only hours before. Caleb had gone out to check the fences and the young horses, whistling as he pulled on his coat. Grace had been kneading dough in the kitchen, humming a hymn her mother used to sing. Then the sky began to change. At first, it looked like dusk had arrived too early. Then the trees began to sway. The wind howled once, then twice, and then it did not stop. When she looked out the window, the sky was no longer gray. It was white. Not soft, but blinding. Not gentle, but furious. She waited an hour, then 2, no sign of him. By the 3rd hour, Grace pulled on every layer she owned, tied a scarf tightly around her face, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit her like a wall. The wind clawed at her coat. Snow stung her eyes. But she walked. 1 step, then another. She found Caleb near the creek, slumped beside a fallen tree, one hand still gripping the reins of a frightened mare. He had slipped, hit the rocks, and broken something. She didn't ask. She didn't panic. She simply knelt, whispered his name, and pulled his arm over her shoulder. Together, they moved through the blizzard. Step by agonizing step. The mare followed skittish but loyal. Grace couldn't feel her fingers. Could barely hear Caleb's breath. But she didn't stop. She didn't dare. By the time they reached the house, the storm had become a living thing. It shrieked against the windows as she dragged Caleb in, removed his coat, and saw the blood. His side was torn, deep, angry, his face pale. She had been a nurse once, but never had she worked on someone she cared for this way. She boiled water, found the whiskey, tore linen into strips. Her hands moved from memory. Stitch, clean, bandage, whisper, pray. For 2 days, Caleb drifted in and out. Fever took him. The storm raged, and the house, that little house that had become her shelter, became her battlefield. Grace didn't sleep. She fed the fire, fed him broth, cleaned the wound again and again. Outside, the snow buried the world. Inside, she fought like hell to keep it from burying him. By the 5th day, the storm began to ease. By the 7th, Caleb opened his eyes and said her name. She wept quietly, not out of fear, but relief. Bone-deep, soul-deep relief. He tried to sit up. She stopped him. You need rest. I need you, he said, his voice rough. I always have. She took his hand. I'm not going anywhere. The days that followed were a strange kind of blessing. While he healed, she did everything the animals, the wood, the cooking, the cleaning, the snow off the roof. She even fired the rifle once when a coyote came too close to the chickens. The townspeople offered help. She declined, not out of pride, but because she needed to know she could do it. For him, for her, for them. Her body ached, her hands cracked. But each night when she sat beside his bed, she felt something blooming. Not romance, not yet, but a kind of power, a knowing. She had never seen herself this way before. Capable, steady, unshakable. Caleb watched her with wonder. "You saved me," he said one night. "You would have done the same." He nodded. "Maybe. But no one's ever fought for me like that." Then came the knock. It was late, the sun low. Grace opened the door and stared. Walter, thinner, humbled, hat in hand. "I heard about the storm," he said, "and about what you did. I was wrong, Grace." She said nothing. "I see you now," he said, "and I wonder if you might forgive me. Maybe give me another chance." Behind her, Caleb had come to stand. He said nothing, just placed a hand on the doorframe. Grace looked at Walter, really looked, and then she smiled. Not cruelly, but with the peace of a woman who no longer needed answers. "I don't need an apology," she said. "I needed the space to become who I was meant to be, and you gave me that, not by staying, but by leaving." He opened his mouth, closed it, then nodded. "I wish you well," she said gently. Walter turned and left. She closed the door. Caleb exhaled. "You handled that better than I would have." She turned. "I wasn't defending myself. I was honoring what I've built, what we've built." That night, she sat by the fire and stared into the flames. Life had tested her. Not in grand dramatic ways, but in small quiet ones. The kind that broke you slowly, then asked if you'd rebuild. She had. And now, in the stillness after the storm, she understood something she hadn't before. She didn't come to Wyoming looking for love. She came looking for a place to be whole. And she had found it. Right there in the hush of winter beside a man who didn't need her to be anything but exactly who she was. Grace didn't fall in love like people expected. There were no fireworks, no grand proclamations shouted from hilltops. What she found instead, tucked in the quiet folds of everyday life, was something gentler and far more enduring. Love, when it came to her, arrived like a spring after a long, brutal winter, not sudden but soft. And oh, how it grew. Caleb recovered slowly. He moved with caution, one arm close to his ribs for weeks. Grace kept the fire burning and the meals warm. She made jokes to keep his spirits high and left warm socks on the foot of his bed each morning. He noticed everything. The way she always turned his cup so the handle pointed toward him. The way she paused when passing the window watching the thaw settle over the land. The way her voice lowered when reading aloud, not for effect, but out of reverence. There was a shift between them, and neither tried to name it too soon. Words felt too fragile, and what they were building didn't need naming just yet. Instead, they shared time. Long afternoons in the garden, knees in the dirt, laughter carried on the breeze. Late nights watching the fire flicker stories traded like old coins. She told him about her father's stubbornness, her mother's quiet strength. He told her how he learned to fix things not because he loved it, but because life demanded it. One evening, she brought out her journal. She hadn't meant to read it aloud, but as she turned its pages, a sentence caught in her throat. "I used to think I was waiting for someone to choose me," she said softly. "But I realize now I was waiting to choose myself." Caleb reached for her hand then and held it in silence. The townsfolk noticed the change before either of them gave it a name. Mrs. Conway from the bakery said, "You've got a glow about you." The butcher's wife offered her a basket of pears and whispered, "You're not just his nurse anymore, are you?" It wasn't scandal, it was quiet admiration. So when one warm morning in early June, Caleb asked her to marry him, it didn't feel like a question. It felt like the next natural breath. He didn't kneel. He didn't offer a ring at first. He simply said, "I'd like you to stay for good, if that's what you want to." She said yes without hesitation. Their wedding was held on the porch under the soft shade of the willow tree Caleb's father had planted decades earlier. The local pastor stood with a Bible worn thin. A few neighbors came with fresh bread and sweet tea. Grace wore a simple cotton dress, her silver hair pinned back with a sprig of lavender. Caleb wore a clean shirt and polished boots. They exchanged vows. They wrote themselves quiet promises deep as roots. That summer, Grace's garden exploded in color. Tomatoes, squash, beans, rows of sunflowers stretching like they were reaching for heaven. Caleb built a new coop for the hens. Grace painted the porch swing white. They sat there every evening, side by side, watching the sky change colors, speaking less and understanding more. People began writing her letters. Word had spread not about the rejection at the church, but what she did after. Women from neighboring towns wrote things like, "You reminded me, I still matter. And I thought my time had passed until I heard your story." Grace kept every letter in a wooden box by her writing desk. Some nights she read them aloud to Caleb. Some nights she simply pressed them to her chest. One letter from a woman in her 60s read, "You gave me courage to love myself again." Grace wept when she read that one. Caleb built her a small writing cabin near the edge of the pasture. Just one room with a desk, a window, and shelves for her journals. She spent her mornings there writing letters in return, planting seeds of hope for strangers she might never meet. One afternoon, she stood at the door of the cabin and looked out over the land. The fields shimmered gold. Caleb was mending the fence. A pair of deer stood at the edge of the woods. She closed her eyes and breathed in the moment. She had found it. Not the fairy tale. Not the dream she once imagined as a girl in a starched school uniform, but something far better. A life built on partnership, respect, shared labor, quiet joy, not being rescued but rising, not waiting to be chosen but choosing herself, and being met halfway by someone who saw her fully. That night, as they sat on the porch swing, Caleb turned to her and said, "You ever think about what would have happened if Walter hadn't left you standing there?" She smiled. "I'd probably be sitting in some stranger's house pretending to be content, wondering what it would have felt like to be truly seen." He nodded. "I don't say it enough, but I'm thankful. For that day, for that letter, for you." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Me too," she whispered. The wind rustled through the trees. A soft, warm breeze, the kind that promises change without warning. And in that moment, Grace knew something she would carry for the rest of her days. Love didn't come too late. It came exactly when she was ready to receive it. Grace McAllister's story was never meant to be extraordinary, and yet, in its quiet defiance in every breath of courage she took, when the world tried to silence her, it became something far more powerful than legend. It became real. Her journey did not begin with love. It began with heartbreak. A rejection that could have buried her spirit became the very ground where she chose to plant her strength. She arrived in Jackson Hole not as a hopeful bride, but as a woman holding on to the final thread of self-worth, unsure whether it would hold. She was dismissed by the man who once made promises in ink and broken them in cowardice, and she stood tall in the face of it. Her voice didn't shake. Her eyes didn't lower. That was the moment everything changed, not because someone came to her rescue, but because she never let herself be small again. When Caleb Rowe stepped forward, it wasn't to save her. It was to recognize her. And that distinction made all the difference. He didn't ask her to be anyone else. He didn't require her to be younger, softer, less experienced. He simply asked if he could know her. And Grace, who had long hidden her heart behind practicality and grief, dared to say yes. What followed wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was something far rarer. A slow, steady building of trust. Shared mornings. Silent evenings. a life shaped not by declarations but by devotion. They planted vegetables, raised animals, and watched the seasons move like chapters of their own story. They didn't rush, they didn't pretend, and in that honesty something remarkable bloomed. Grace's impact rippled beyond the ranch. Letters poured in from women she had never met. Her courage awakened theirs. Her story reminded them that age is not a boundary but a season. That love, respect, and new beginnings do not expire with youth. Her porch became a place of gathering. Her words became comfort. Her presence became proof. She showed that hope doesn't diminish with time, it deepens. In the final stretch of her journey, she didn't ask the world to give her a stage. She built her own. With ink-stained fingers and earth-covered hands, she told the truth that sometimes the greatest love stories are born not in youth but in wisdom, not in rescue but in recognition, not in the fairy tales of others but in the lives we dare to claim for ourselves. She planted resilience where others saw ruin. She built a home where others saw an ending. The lesson Grace leaves us is not simply about romance. It's about choosing dignity when shame is easier, about showing up for ourselves when others walk away, about planting roots in unexpected soil and trusting that even the most weathered heart can still bloom. It's about recognizing the value in who we are, now, not who we were, or who others expected us to be. So, what can we take from Grace's story if you've ever felt overlooked or underestimated? If you've wondered whether your best days are behind you? If you've sat quietly while others lived loudly, convincing yourself that time had run out, let Grace remind you it hasn't. You're not too old, too far gone, too late to be chosen not by someone else, and certainly not by yourself. You are not behind, you are right on time. Her story tells us to begin again at any age with whatever strength we have left. Begin again in love. Begin again in purpose. Begin again in belief. Grace's life blossomed not because she waited for the world to notice her, but because she noticed herself. She said, "I am still here," and in doing so she called back every part of herself that had been forgotten. Maybe you don't have a ranch or a porch swing or a man like Caleb waiting in the wings, but you do have a voice, a heart, a reason. You have the power to start something honest no matter how long it's been. Maybe that's writing a letter you've been too afraid to send. Maybe it's starting the garden you never got around to planting. Maybe it's saying out loud, "I still matter." Start small, plant one seed, speak one truth. Reach for one hand, let someone in. Or, better yet, let yourself back in, because the world doesn't need perfect people. It needs people who are willing to try again, and again, and again. Grace's story is a testament that the most meaningful lives are not built in a rush, but in the slow bloom, in the daily decisions to keep going, to hold dignity in one hand and courage in the other. To stand in front of a closed door and knock anyway, to believe in something soft and strong enough to survive the storm. Thank you for spending this time with Grace. If her journey touched your heart, if you saw a piece of yourself in her courage, then please help us continue to share stories like this. Stories that don't just entertain but heal. Stories that remind us we're never too old, too late, or too much to be loved. That no matter where you are in life, your next chapter could be the most beautiful one yet. Please subscribe to our channel. Your support doesn't just keep these stories alive, it gives us the strength to tell the next one. And we promise there are many more waiting to bloom. Until then, be gentle with yourself. Believe in second chances. And remember, the quietest blooms often carry the sweetest scent.